Welcome back to Emovura Audio Books, the channel where true crime meets storytelling and every case comes alive in sound. Tonight's story is one that unfolded quietly, over coffee and old friendship, before turning into something no one in the village ever forgot. Before we begin, if you enjoy narrated mysteries like this one, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next case file. Tonight, we're traveling to the small English village of Bramblewick, to a coffee house called the Gilded Leaf, where a reunion between three lifelong friends was about to end in tragedy. Imagine, for a moment, sitting at a corner table in your favorite café, the one with the good light and the familiar smell of fresh bread, surrounded by the two people you have trusted longest in the world. Imagine the warmth of the cup in your hands, the easy rhythm of old jokes, the particular comfort of being fully known by the people sitting across from you. Now imagine that warmth turning, within minutes, into something your body cannot explain, a tightening in your throat, a swimming behind your eyes, and the last thing you see before the room goes dark is the face of someone who has loved you since you were both small enough to hold hands crossing the village green. This is that story. It was just after 4 o'clock on a bright Thursday afternoon in early September when 29-year-old Alice Fenwick stepped off the branch line train at Bramblewick station, a small suitcase rolling behind her on the uneven platform. Bramblewick was the kind of village that postcards were made of, a cluster of honey-colored stone cottages arranged around a green, a church with a crooked spire that had stood since the 14th century, and a high street lined with independent shops that had survived, against all odds, the arrival of the supermarket on the Ring Road. It sat in a shallow valley in the fictional county of Ashmore, 3 hours from London by train, surrounded by hedgerows and sheep pasture. Alice had grown up here. She had gone to the village primary school, then the comprehensive in the market town 6 miles away, and she had spent every childhood summer running wild across Bramblewick Common with her two closest friends, Naomi Reyes and Fionn Price. The three of them had been inseparable, so much so that the older residents of the village still, 20 years later, referred to them collectively as the Three Graces, a nickname none of them had ever quite managed to shake. But Alice had left Bramblewick at 18, first for university in Manchester, and then, 6 years ago, for a marketing job in Singapore that had turned into a life. She had built a career, a flat overlooking Marina Bay, and a circle of friends who knew nothing about muddy Wellington boots or church fates. She hadn't been back to the village in almost 4 years, not since her mother's funeral, an occasion too raw and too brief for anything resembling a proper reunion. This time was different. This time, she was coming home to celebrate. Bramblewick had a way of holding on to its residents even after they left, in the way small villages do. Alice's mother had been the postmistress for 31 years, and half the village still called Alice the postmistress's girl without any apparent awareness that the postmistress had been gone for 4 years and the post office itself, absorbed into the newsagents, had closed not long after. Her father, retired now to a bungalow on the edge of the common, still walked his elderly spaniel past the village green every morning at 8, and it was through him, mostly, that Alice kept up with a small, constant churn of Bramblewick gossip, who had sold their cottage to a family from London, whose son had gotten into Oxford, whose marriage had quietly ended over the winter. It was her father, in fact, who had first mentioned that Naomi and Fionn were still close, still meeting for coffee most Sunday mornings, still, in the way of people who had never left a place, entangled in each other's lives in 100 small, ordinary ways that Alice, from her flat above Marina Bay, found both comforting and faintly alien. Naomi Reyes, steady, sharp-tongued Naomi, who had stayed in Bramblewick and quietly built up a thriving veterinary practice on the edge of the village, had gotten engaged in the spring. Her fiancé, a soft-spoken landscape architect named Tom Ainsley, had proposed on the very same common where the three girls used to play, and Naomi wanted, more than anything, for Alice and Fionn to be there when she chose her wedding dress, and to properly celebrate before the whirlwind of wedding planning consumed her. Fionn Price, the third of the trio, had never left Ashmore at all. She ran a small bakery café 2 doors down from the Gilded Leaf, and though she and Alice had drifted over the years, texting on birthdays, liking each other's photos, the low hum of a friendship kept alive mostly out of habit. The plan to reunite for Naomi's engagement had reignited something. In the weeks leading up to Alice's visit, the group chat the three of them shared had lit up more than it had in years. In the days leading up to the reunion, Fionn had seemed, to anyone paying close attention, subtly unlike herself. Her assistant at the bakery, a 19-year-old apprentice named Daisy Cottrell, would later tell police that Fionn had taken 3 phone calls in the 2 days before the reunion that had left her visibly shaken, stepping out into the back alley behind the ovens to take them, returning each time paler and quieter than before. Once, Daisy said, she had come back inside and simply stood very still at the proving counter for almost a full minute, flour dusting slowly from her hands onto the floor, before seeming to catch herself and returning to work as though nothing had happened. When Daisy asked if everything was all right, Fionn had smiled. Too brightly, Daisy thought, though she hadn't dwelled on it at the time, and said only that she was sorting something out, nothing to worry about. Whatever Fionn was sorting out, she never told anyone what it was, and by the time investigators pieced together, months later, what those 3 phone calls had likely concerned, there was no one left to explain them from her side. They'd arranged to meet at 5 o'clock at the Gilded Leaf, the village's newest and most fashionable coffee house, tucked into a converted wool merchant's warehouse at the top of the high street. It had opened only 18 months earlier, owned by a couple who'd relocated from Bristol, and it had quickly become the place to be seen in Bramblewick, all exposed brick, hanging ferns, and a menu of small-batch coffee and elaborate patisserie that would not have looked out of place in a much larger city. Alice arrived early. She always did. It was a habit left over from years of client meetings where lateness cost contracts, and it didn't fade just because she was thousands of miles from Singapore. She ducked into the Gilded Leaf at 4:45, secured their usual corner table beneath the exposed roof beams, and ordered herself a flat white while she waited. The café was warm and golden in the late afternoon light. A woman Alice vaguely recognized from school, Priya Okonkwo Hart, 2 years above her, now apparently the co-owner alongside her husband, waved from behind the counter and sent over a slice of lemon drizzle cake. On the house, welcome home. Alice remembered, distantly, that Priya had married into the Hart family who ran the local building firm, and that there had once been some minor scandal about the firm underbidding a council contract. Village memory ran long and detailed. Whatever else changed. At 5:05, Fionn arrived in a flour-dusted apron she hadn't bothered to remove, breathless and apologetic, smelling of cinnamon and yeast. She hugged Alice fiercely, holding on a beat longer than necessary, and Alice felt, for the first time since landing, that she really was home. Naomi arrived last at 1:15, her hands still faintly smelling of antiseptic from an emergency cesarean she'd performed that morning on a Labrador named Custard. She wore her engagement ring on a plain chain around her neck rather than on her finger. "I keep losing weight from the wedding stress. It goes flying off if I'm not careful." And it caught the light as she leaned in to embrace first Alice, then Fionn. For the first hour, it was everything a reunion should be. Overlapping stories, interrupted laughter, the particular ease of people who had known each other since before they knew themselves. Naomi described, in exhaustive and hilarious detail, the disaster of a dress-fitting appointment in the market town, where she'd gotten stuck in a sample gown and had to be extracted by 2 shop assistants and a bottle of vegetable oil applied to her hips. Fionn recounted the ongoing feud with the butcher next door over parking. Alice, for her part, found herself talking more than she had in months about Singapore, about a relationship that had quietly ended in the spring, about how strange and wonderful it was to smell rain on English pavement again. At one point, Alice raised the subject of Fionn's investment scheme, mostly out of polite curiosity. Her father had mentioned, in passing, that half the village seemed to have money tied up in one of Fionn's projects. Fionn had laughed it off with practiced ease, saying only that the market had been a bit sluggish this quarter, nothing to worry about, and steering the conversation toward Naomi's wedding venue instead. Naomi, Alice would later recall under oath, had gone very quiet during this exchange, stirring her coffee with unusual concentration, and had not looked up until the subject had safely passed. At the time, Alice read it as nothing more than bridal nerves. It was only much later, replaying the afternoon in her mind for the 100th time from a hospital bed, that she recognized it for what the prosecution would argue it truly was: the last, brittle silence of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do. It was Naomi who ordered the second round, insisting, over Alice's protest that she'd pay. She'd flown 15 hours. The least she could do was buy the coffee. That this one was on her, in celebration. She went up to the counter herself while Alice and Fionn continued talking, and she came back a few minutes later carrying a small wooden tray with 3 drinks, a flat white for Alice, an oat milk latte for Fionn, and an Americano for herself. "Priya's doing a new thing with the syrups," Naomi said, setting the tray down. "Wanted us to try the new hazelnut one. I told her we were celebrating, so she threw in a bit extra for you. Al, village hospitality and all that." Alice remembers. She would tell the inquest jury this, 18 months later, her voice carefully steady, that her flat white tasted slightly different that afternoon. Sweeter, with a faint bitterness underneath the hazelnut that she assumed, at the time, was simply an unfamiliar syrup. She drank perhaps 2/3 of the cup before the conversation moved on to Naomi's parents, and the drink went lukewarm and largely forgotten on the table. It was Fionn who fell ill first. At around 6:15, mid-sentence, Fionn suddenly stopped talking, pressed a hand flat against her sternum, and said, in a small, confused voice, that she felt strange. Within a minute, her face had drained of color. She complained of a tightening in her throat, a metallic taste, and then, quite suddenly, she was retching, her whole body seizing forward over the edge of the table. Alice would later describe the next several minutes as the strangest of her life. The café falling into that peculiar hush that surrounds an emergency, other patrons half rising from their seats, Priya rushing over from behind the counter, someone already dialing 999. And then, as she reached out to steady Fionn, Alice felt her own head swim, a wrongness blooming behind her eyes, her vision tunneling at the edges. She remembers Naomi's face swimming above her, worried, she thought, though later she would turn that memory over and over, unable to decide if what she'd seen in Naomi's expression, in that half-second, had been fear or something closer to calculation. Then Alice, too, went down, her chair scraping backward across the café's reclaimed floorboards. Naomi did not fall ill. The Ashmore and District Ambulance Service reached the Gilded Leaf within 11 minutes. Both Alice and Fionn were unconscious by the time paramedics arrived. Both were rushed to Ashmore District General, where emergency physicians, working against a clock they did not yet understand, administered activated charcoal and ran a panel of toxicology tests that would not return results for nearly 6 hours. The first officer on scene, a young constable named Reese Talbot, barely 18 months out of training college, would later describe the café that evening as the strangest thing he had encountered in his short career. A room full of ordinary Thursday customers frozen mid-motion, teacups still steaming on the tables, while paramedics worked over two women on the floor beneath the exposed roof beams. He had the presence of mind to seal off the counter area and bag the remaining drinks from the tray before anyone could clear them away, a decision that would later prove decisive, since it preserved the residue that eventually confirmed exactly which cups had been contaminated and which had not. Fionn Price was pronounced dead at 9:52 that evening. The cause, eventually determined, was acute poisoning by a compound called aconitine, an alkaloid derived from monkshood, a purple-flowered plant that grew, unremarkably and rather beautifully, in cottage gardens across the whole of Ashmore, including, as it happened, in a bed just outside Naomi Reyes's veterinary surgery. Alice survived. Barely. She spent 4 days in intensive care, her heart rhythm swinging dangerously between arrhythmias that specialists later said, with some wonder, should by rights have killed her. She would tell the inquest that she remembered almost nothing after the paramedics arrived, only fragments, disconnected and dreamlike, of white ceiling tiles and someone's hand, cold, gripping hers. News of what had happened at the Gilded Leaf spread through Bramblewick before the church bells had finished ringing for evensong. By the following morning, a regional news van was parked outside the café, and by the weekend, the story had reached the national press. A picturesque Ashmore village, a fashionable coffee house, a dead woman and a critically ill friend, and no obvious explanation. Reporters camped outside Ashmore District General for the better part of a week, and the Bramblewick Facebook community group, ordinarily reserved for lost cats and complaints about verge parking, filled overnight with a churn of speculation, sympathy, and, as always happens, armchair theorizing that ranged from the plausible to the wildly unkind. The investigation that followed consumed Bramblewick for the better part of a year. Detective Inspector Marcus Odegwu of the Ashmore Constabulary was assigned the case, within hours of the toxicology results confirming that this had been no accident. Monkshood poisoning severe enough to kill a healthy adult required a deliberate, concentrated dose, not an accidental brush with a garden plant. Someone had prepared the poison. Someone had delivered it into 2 specific cups of coffee, out of the dozens served at the Gilded Leaf that afternoon. Odegwu had joined the Ashmore Constabulary 18 years earlier and had, by his own admission, never worked a poisoning case before, a rarity even across a long career spent mostly on burglary rings and the occasional violent assault. He would later tell a training seminar that his first instinct, on hearing the toxicology results, was disbelief. Bramblewick was not, in his words, the kind of place where anyone imagined this sort of thing happening, a sentiment he came to recognize over the following months as exactly the assumption that had allowed it to happen at all. D.I. Odegwu's team began where any investigation of this kind begins, with the last hour of the victims' lives traced backward, minute by minute. CCTV from inside the café, grainy but sufficient, showed Naomi Reyes approaching the counter at 5:52 p.m., ordering 3 drinks, and waiting by the collection point while they were prepared. Critically, the footage showed a gap of nearly 90 seconds during which Naomi stood alone at the counter, the barista having stepped away to answer the café's phone, and the finished drinks sitting, briefly, unattended, and within her reach. It was not, on its own, proof of anything, but it was enough to make Naomi Reyes the first, and for some time the only, person of serious interest. Before that, however, detectives had followed 2 other lines of inquiry, each of which occupied significant resources before ultimately leading nowhere. The first concerned a delivery driver who had dropped off a consignment of pastry flour to the Gilded Leaf that same afternoon and had briefly been alone in the store cupboard adjoining the kitchen, He was cleared within days once his movements were corroborated by GPS data from his van and by the till receipts of 2 other shops he had visited on his round. The second, more painful for those involved, centered on Fionn Price's ex-husband, a man named Callum Price, from whom she had separated 5 years earlier following what neighbors described only as a difficult few years. Callum had, by his own admission, sent Fionn a handful of angry messages in the months before her death, prompted by a dispute over their teenage son's school fees, and for nearly 3 weeks he sat under the specific and unbearable suspicion of a village that had already half convicted him in its own mind. He was eliminated as a suspect once it was established, beyond doubt, that he had been 200 miles away at a plumbing trade conference in Newcastle on the afternoon of the poisoning, a fact the local paper reported with considerably less prominence than it had given his arrest for questioning. What emerged over the following weeks, through painstaking work, bank records, phone data, and interviews with a widening circle of Naomi's clients, colleagues, and acquaintances, was a portrait entirely at odds with the woman Bramblewick believed it knew. Naomi's veterinary practice, D.I. Odegwa's team discovered, was in serious financial trouble. She had taken out 2 substantial loans in the previous 18 months, both against the practice's premises, to cover a shortfall that had begun, quietly, 3 years earlier. The shortfall had a name: Fionn Price. It emerged that Fionn, alongside running her bakery, had for several years managed a modest joint investment on Naomi's behalf, a scheme, informal and built entirely on trust between old friends, in which Fionn pooled small sums from several Bramblewick residents into what she described as a low-risk property fund tied to a development in the market town. Naomi had invested nearly £60,000 of her practice's capital, money meant for a planned expansion, believing it would return steadily and safely. There was no property fund. There had never been a property fund. Fionn had been quietly siphoning the pooled investments to cover debts of her own, a bakery that had never turned the profit she claimed it had, a divorce 5 years earlier that had cost more than she'd admitted to anyone, and, investigators eventually found, a modest but persistent gambling habit conducted almost entirely online, invisible to the village that thought it knew everything about everyone. Forensic accountants brought in to examine Fionn's finances traced the earliest missing sums back nearly 6 years, long before the property fund had even been formally proposed to Naomi, meaning Fionn had, in effect, been running the deception in some form for the better part of a decade, patching one shortfall with the next investor's money in a pattern accountants described in court as a textbook example of a scheme that survives only as long as new contributions keep arriving to cover the old ones. Naomi was not the only victim of the scheme. Detectives eventually identified 6 other Bramblewick residents who had entrusted sums ranging from £2,000 to £40,000 to Fionn's fictitious fund, including the vicar's wife, who had invested a modest legacy left to her by her own mother, and Priya Okonkwo Hart's husband, who had put in a portion of the loan that financed the Gilded Leaf itself, a detail that, once it emerged at trial, cast a grim new light on Priya's cheerful gift of lemon drizzle cake on the afternoon of the poisoning. None of the other investors, investigators concluded, had known enough or been desperate enough to do what Naomi allegedly did. Most had simply resigned themselves to the loss, too embarrassed by their own credulity to make much noise about it. When investigators finally obtained a warrant to search Naomi's veterinary surgery and the small flat above it where she had lived since her own divorce from a previous relationship years earlier, they found, tucked into a locked drawer in the surgery's dispensary, a folded sheet of paper with what appeared to be a hand-drawn diagram of a monkshood plant's root structure, annotated in Naomi's handwriting with dosage calculations that closely mirrored the concentration later found in Fionn's system. A pair of nitrile gloves, of a type used throughout the practice for routine procedures, was recovered from a waste bin behind the surgery's outbuilding. Forensic analysis found trace amounts of aconitine on the interior surface of one glove, along with Naomi's own skin cells. The defense argued that gloves of this kind were used and discarded by the practice dozens of times a week for entirely unrelated purposes, and that trace contamination could have occurred at any point during routine handling of garden specimens brought in by concerned pet owners. The prosecution countered that the coincidence, layered atop the search history and the missing 60,000 pounds, strained credulity past its breaking point. Naomi had discovered the fraud only 10 weeks before the poisoning, when she'd finally demanded documentation ahead of her wedding, needing to know precisely what capital she had to work with. Confronted with the truth that her 60,000 pounds was gone, and that Fionn's bakery and life were built on debts stacked upon debts, Naomi had not gone to the police. Financial records recovered from her laptop, and a search history her defense would later argue was inconclusive, but the prosecution called damning, showed searches conducted over several weeks for aconitine poisoning symptoms, monkshood toxicity untraceable, and 3 days before the reunion at the Gilded Leaf, how long does poison take to work in coffee? The prosecution's case, presented 18 months later at Ashmore Crown Court, argued that Naomi Reyes had planned to kill Fionn Price alone, to punish the friend who had stolen from her and jeopardized the practice she'd spent a decade building, and that Alice Fenwick, arriving home for the first time in years, had been drawn into the plan only incidentally, seated at the same table, drinking from a tray prepared by the same hand. Whether Alice had been poisoned deliberately as a witness to be silenced, or had received a contaminated drink purely through the chaos of a shared tray and a moment of panicked improvisation, was a question the court could never fully resolve. Naomi's own defense barrister argued precisely that ambiguity, that the case against his client, while circumstantial in its particulars, rested on a narrative prosecutors had constructed rather than proven. Jury selection alone took the better part of 2 days, owing to how many prospective jurors in the Ashmore Crown Court's catchment area turned out to have some personal connection to the case: a cousin who had banked with Naomi's practice, a neighbor who had once bought a cake from Fionn's bakery for a christening, a woman who, it emerged only after she had already been seated, had gone to school with Priya Okonkwo Hart. The judge excused 11 potential jurors before a panel could finally be sworn in, a delay that the local paper noted, not unreasonably, said as much about the intimacy of village life as anything that would be argued in the weeks that followed. The trial ran for 11 days. Alice Fenwick, weakened still, nearly a year on, by the lasting effects of the poisoning on her heart, gave evidence from behind a screen, unable to look at the woman she had known since they were 6 years old building sandcastles on the same village green. She described, in a voice the court reporter noted was almost entirely without inflection, the taste of hazelnut and something bitter beneath it, the particular quality of Naomi's face swimming above her as she went down. The prosecution called a forensic toxicologist, Dr. Helena Marsh, who explained to the jury, in careful and deliberately unhurried terms, exactly what aconitine does to the human body, how it disrupts the sodium channels in cardiac tissue, producing the tingling, the nausea, and eventually the fatal arrhythmias that had claimed Fionn Price's life within hours. How a lethal dose could be extracted from the root of a monkshood plant with nothing more sophisticated than a kitchen grater and a length of muslin cloth, and how the compound, unless specifically tested for, was easily missed by standard toxicology screens, which was, the prosecution argued, precisely why Naomi, a veterinary surgeon with a working knowledge of pharmacology and animal anesthesia, had chosen it. A forensic psychologist called by the prosecution, Dr. Owen Bassey, testified about the phenomenon of what he termed betrayal escalation, in individuals with no prior history of violence, the way a single, deeply personal financial and emotional betrayal, particularly one bound up with a person's professional identity and long-term security, could in rare cases produce a level of premeditated harm entirely disproportionate to anything in that person's previous behavior. He was careful, under cross-examination, to concede that his evidence could not establish that Naomi Reyes had, in fact, committed the poisoning, only that the psychological profile the prosecution described was internally consistent and not, in his clinical experience, unprecedented. Priya Okonkwo-Hart took the stand to confirm the 90-second gap in her CCTV footage and to describe, tearfully, how she had thrown in the extra hazelnut syrup herself at Naomi's request, believing it to be nothing more than a kind gesture toward a friend visiting from abroad. Tom Ainsley, Naomi's fiancé, gave evidence for the defense, testifying that Naomi had seemed, in the weeks before the poisoning, unhappy and preoccupied but never violent, and that he did not believe her capable of what she stood accused of. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged that he had not known about the missing £60,000 until police told him. In her closing statement, the lead prosecutor told the jury that this was, at its heart, a case about the particular betrayal that only someone who loves you can commit, that Naomi Reyes had not been provoked by a stranger's cruelty, but by the discovery that a woman she had trusted since childhood had quietly hollowed out the future she was building. The defense, in turn, urged the jury to resist the pull of a tidy narrative, arguing that grief and circumstantial coincidence had been woven together into a story that felt satisfying rather than one that had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for just under 9 hours. Naomi Reyes was found guilty of the murder of Fian Price and the attempted murder of Alice Fenwick, and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. She showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read, though several people in the public gallery reported that Alice Fenwick, seated near the back of the court, wept silently throughout. Bramblewick has never quite recovered its old rhythm. The Gilded Leaf closed within 6 months of the trial's conclusion. Priya and her husband, unable to bear the weight of what their café had become in the village's memory, sold the building, which now stands empty, its hanging ferns long since dead in the window. For a long while afterward, villagers would cross the street rather than walk directly past its darkened windows, as though proximity itself carried some residue of what had happened inside. The verdict, when it came, did not settle the village the way verdicts are supposed to. Some in Bramblewick continued to insist that Naomi Reyes, whom many had known since she was a child scraping her knees on the common, could not possibly have done what the court found she had done, and that the true story remained, somehow, undiscovered. Others pointed to the missing £60,000 and the search history recovered from her laptop, and said there was nothing left to wonder about at all. The local paper ran a 6-part series marking the first anniversary of the verdict, interviewing more than a dozen residents, and found the village split almost exactly down the middle, a division that, 5 years on, has softened only slightly and never entirely closed. Alice Fenwick did not return to Singapore. She lives now on the edge of Bramblewick, in a cottage that overlooks the same common where 3 girls once played, and where, some 25 years later, one of them planned to end the life of another over the collection point of a coffee counter. She has spoken publicly only once about what happened, at a small memorial event held on the 2nd anniversary of Fian's death, where she said simply that she still could not decide which was harder to live with, what Fian had done to Naomi, what Naomi had done to Fian, or the fact that for one terrible half-second in a golden, ordinary café, she had looked into the eyes of a childhood friend and understood, without being able to say so, that she was about to die. Naomi Reyes maintains from prison that she never intended to harm Alice. Whether that is true remains, like so much else in this case, a question the village of Bramblewick has learned to live without answering. Naomi has, according to prison visitor logs later referenced in a follow-up newspaper feature, received no visitors in the past 3 years beyond a single appointment with her defense solicitor regarding a since-abandoned second appeal. She has declined every media request for comment, with the exception of a short handwritten statement passed to a local reporter through her solicitor 2 years into her sentence, in which she wrote only that she thought of Fian every single day, in ways I doubt anyone in Bramblewick would believe or want to. Detective Inspector Odigwu, now retired from the Ashmore Constabulary, has spoken about the case only once, at a policing conference 2 years after the conviction, where he described it as the clearest example I have ever seen of how little we truly know about the people closest to us. Tom Ainsley never married. He sold the house he and Naomi had bought together and moved away from Ashmore entirely, and villagers say he has not been seen in Bramblewick since. The vicar's wife, who lost the modest legacy from her mother, still attends the church across from the green every Sunday, though she no longer speaks about the investment scheme or about Fian to anyone. A small stone bench was placed on Bramblewick Common 18 months after the trial concluded, funded by public donation, dedicated simply to FP, remembered by the village she loved. Alice Fenwick was there for its unveiling. She still visits it, her father says, most Sunday mornings alone. In the months following the trial, Alice was approached twice by publishers hoping she would write a memoir about the poisoning and its aftermath. She declined both times, telling the one journalist who eventually persuaded her to comment that she did not want Fian or Naomi reduced to a chapter title. Daisy Cottrell, the bakery apprentice who had noticed Fian's strange final days, took over the lease on the old bakery premises 2 years later and reopened it under a new name, though she kept, framed above the till, a small photograph of Fian pulling a tray of bread from the oven, taken the summer before she died. When asked why, Daisy has said simply that somebody in Bramblewick ought to remember her as she was, and not only as she ended. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a small village after something like this happens, not the ordinary quiet of a sleepy Sunday, but a wariness that lingers in the way neighbors greet each other, in the extra beat of hesitation before someone accepts a homemade cake or a cup of tea from a friend of long standing. Bramblewick's vicar, delivering a sermon on the first anniversary of Fian's death, told his congregation that the hardest lesson of the whole affair was not that a stranger could do them harm. Villages like his had always understood that danger might come from outside, but that harm could be planned, patiently and coldly, by someone who had known you your entire life, who had held your hand at a christening or stood beside you at a graveside, and who could still, afterward, sit across a café table and watch you drink. It is a lesson, perhaps, that reaches well beyond the boundaries of one Ashmore village. And it's why, more than anything else, this case has stayed with us here at Emovura. Perhaps that is the quiet, uncomfortable thread running through this entire story, not the poison itself, nor even the money that drove someone to use it, but the ordinary, golden afternoon that came before, 3 women who had known each other their whole lives, laughing over coffee, utterly certain, as most of us would be, that they knew exactly who was sitting across the table from them. That's the story of the Gilded Leaf, here on Emovura Audio Books. If tonight's episode kept you company, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. This is Emovura Audio Books, signing off. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next story.